we were getting a sense of whether Nigeria can work to optimum capacity over the next few years if they were to deal with some of their infrastructure problems and so forth. We're also questioning whether South Africa is really, truly worthy of the invitation to the BRIC economies. And those who are critical say that actually the lobby, George, is being pushed very strongly by China, because China wants to broaden its footprint in Africa and wants to use South Africa as a gateway, South Africa's banks as a depositing post, those kinds of things. And it's not really about South Africa, but it's more about China.
Absolutely, and I would agree with that, to be honest. I think it's probably a multi-pronged strategy that China has with respect to Africa. So if you look at South Africa's banks, just about any well-run economy requires a very solid banking system. It's no coincidence to see China investing quite substantially into South Africa's banking system. And when you have a look at South African banks expanding into Africa, suddenly things start to make a lot more sense. Now, if you've got a China that is investing into a bank that's investing into Africa, well, you get some sense of perspective as how the infrastructure begins to grow within the continent. So I don't think that China per se looks at South Africa as the be-all and end-all of the gateway into Africa. I see them as I think China sees South Africa as one of the prongs of a multi-pronged strategy that it's going to utilize to try and infiltrate and get itself well positioned into the African continent, because there are huge amounts of opportunity.
Is that something for us to be concerned about, that actually this might not be about our accomplishments, this might be about China using us?
I think, you know, it would be understating to say not about our accomplishments, because we have accomplished a lot by developing these sorts of institutions, and you can't downplay those. I think they are important. They will be important to Africa. And I think there's an opportunity for South Africa if it's able to capture some of the interest that China expresses into the rest of the continent. As you've pointed out, South Africa is not a great productive base, but from a services perspective, it maybe could be a lot better. In fact, if you have a look at the makeup of the South African economy over the past 10 years, there's been a general shift towards more capital intensive and service sector industry rather than labor productive type industry. That's been one of the faults, in fact, of the policies that South Africa has implemented, but it gives you some perspective on why potentially South Africa is strategically important.
Bismarck, answer this question as truthfully as you possibly would dare.
Yes.
Does South Africa merit to be part of the BRIC nations of emerging markets?
I think that if we're looking at the potential, because this is a question about which of these economies is potentially significant and strategic enough to serve as a BRIC country if you fast forward 5-10 years from today, based on certain assumptions. Based on the assumptions we see today, based on the infrastructural gap in Nigeria, based on corruption, based on institutional weaknesses, based on that, if that was to continue for the next 5 years, yes, South Africa deserves it. But if that was to change, and we all hope it will change, and then you were to unlock the potential of the country, it will take 2 to 3 years or 4 years of hard work bridging this gap, and you will see that South Africa will pale in comparison to Nigeria in terms of its competitiveness. South Africa is more of a produced wealth economy. Nigeria is more of a natural wealth economy. So converting natural wealth into a produced wealth, so the natural resources are there, the production is there, and then the institutions to garner it are there. If you have those three, then you can easily outperform South Africa. But it's very easy to say this, but these are major, major issues that need to be taken on. And least of all, the need to have a political system that can actually harness this. So that is the truth of the answer.
We've mentioned China and the China factor in this whole dynamic of getting South Africa into this alliance of emerging market economies. And this raises the question of where Nigeria fits in terms of harnessing its relationships with emerging market countries, particularly investors from Russia that have been interested in the oil and gas sector, from India, from China. We know that China's tried to do business in Nigeria, but they've struggled at a regulatory level. They haven't really been able to enter the market in ICT or in oil and gas because of systems failures, some people would argue.
No, I think you have to look at the Chinese strategic objectives at two levels. One is the Chinese economy depends on resources, and it's a resource-dependent economy. So they would go for uranium, iron ore, and certain minerals and all of that. But they also need, at a strategic level, to have access to capacity to actually process some of these resources so that they can be used in a later stage. So what is happening in Nigeria, the Chinese have come in at the railway and infrastructural level. Some of the refinery projects, some of the power projects and all of that. But with an eye purely on the minerals that can be there, and also to have a real chunk of a market which is huge. So that is the, I mean, I think the Chinese need both the South African capacity and the South African advanced economy, intermediate advanced economy, and they need the Nigerian access to the resources and also an eye on the rest of the West African sub-region. So I think in reality, the Chinese incursion here at the strategic level, both from a resource base and from a produce world base, Nigeria serves almost the same purpose, but maybe at a lower level than what South Africa serves today.
George, another criticism, despite the fact that South Africa may be a produced economy, advanced on certain levels, is that you've got, of the 10 fastest growing economies in the world today, about 6 are African economies. Ethiopia, Mozambique, Angola, Rwanda, Nigeria. You know, so when you look at the broader context of where the world is going, again, the growth rates in Africa on average, South Africa lags. The African average is over 5%. The South African growth rate was 3.5% in the last year, and many aren't expecting it to be much higher than that going forward. What does South Africa need to do to really and truly be more competitive in African terms? And yes, many African countries starting from a low base, but also in global terms.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned the low base because that's the first thing I was going to just put some perspective on. South Africa is also a sort of more developed. It's along the developmental curve. You don't get the same level of growth rate once you start hitting that point. But aside from all of that, South Africa, to my mind, unfortunately doesn't tap into its full potential. I would probably put its full potential closer to a figure of around 6–7%. And I think that could be achieved. My take on it as a free market economist is an environment where you've got good regulation, strong regulation, you've got your social policies in place, but they don't need to necessarily be forced upon one through bigger and bigger government. And as government continues to grow, I think that's going to be one of the major constraints. I have issues with a couple of the policies that South Africa's working with. Our labour laws, for example, don't leave much to be desired. And if we're going to try and compete against the likes of other emerging markets that simply do not have those laws, you are going to find South Africa being uncompetitive repeatedly. So there are many aspects to the question. I think there are remnants of the apartheid era with lack of for example, skills, and that comes through education and all sorts of things that we've got to work our way through. But equally, if you have a look at how much South Africa spends on things like education, as a percent of GDP, we're one of the highest in the world, and yet our marks through the course of the past 5 years haven't done particularly well. So we need to improve on delivery, there's no question about it, but there's a lot to unleash out of South Africa too, but I think we need to relook at our overall economic strategies.
Final question to you, Bismarck. All things being equal, structural problems being addressed, labour working at optimum level, education and healthcare being sorted out, regulations being properly harmonized and streamlined, politics being stable in Nigeria. Is Nigeria the natural African giant to represent Africa in international fora?
Definitely. I think, and I was going to make a comment as when you're using growth rates to compare countries, materiality of growth and a fast-growing undeveloped economy is not as significant as a even average growing developed economy in terms of what it brings to the party. But I think that Nigeria is going to address its growth and its development at the same time. So the next 4 or 5 years are going to be very significant. But once that is addressed, I mean, the momentum of the economy is going to be make it unstoppable. no question about it, it will be the giant of Africa. But these problems are not very small problems. At times they are insurmountable.
George?
I don't see this issue of superpowers between Nigeria and South Africa being necessarily the two countries being mutually exclusive. I think globalization is something I believe in very firmly. I think that economics of the African continent as a whole are going to bring many African countries together, and as such each country will probably have its own role to play, and perhaps we should be looking at the continent as a significant superpower rather than specific countries within it.